Salutations and welcome to Monomythic. My name is Kevin Garcia, professional comic book historian. Our episode today is presented as part of the first Geekspanic Heritage Month, a celebration of Hispanic heritage and Latinx history for National Hispanic Heritage Month, which runs from September 15th to October 15th. Geekspanic Heritage Month is presented as a partnership between Monomythic.com and the Nerdtino Expo, the first East Coast Latinx comic book convention. For our episode today, we're joined by Dr. Matthew David Goodwin, for whom we're going to be discussing his past and future collections of sci-fi and fantasy made by Latinx writers, and talking about solidarity in the Latinx community. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Nerdtino for connecting us.
Exactly. I cannot thank him enough. I think it's a great idea. In fact, I'm big on puns, and I actually love the title Geekspanic. I think that sounds good. Speaking of titles, though, I was saying Latinx a lot. In the past, I've said Latinx. I've heard somebody at least once say Latinx. So my question for you is there a correct or preferred form? Before we get into the actual writing, I want to touch base on that title for a second, since it's part of your upcoming book.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating. I mean, first of all, it's a fascinating moment where people are playing with the language, and I think that's a really, really positive moment. I think the thing is to point out that there is a difference between the sort of like Latinx concept as a sort of general concept to refer to the community, and to be all inclusive as much as possible. The X is like is an empty space for anything that can come into that, gender, sexuality. That doesn't mean that we have to use the X constantly in daily life. Spanish has its own like gender structures that are really difficult to get away from, and maybe shouldn't get away from in certain cases. But Latinx is a way to, at certain moments, say, hey, we want to talk about everybody and be inclusive. And it's not meant to be like awkward or strange. It's just it's like a pointer. It's a small shift, so that we can make sure that we're inclusive in our language. And I think that's what people miss. You don't have to change everything about the way you speak, when you're speaking Spanish or English, And I guess also it's interesting that it is coming from primarily the U.S. Like that's where the big kind of impulse behind it has been coming. And
I know there's been some controversy. Yeah. I use the word controversy pretty loosely here, but I guess there's been a little bit of controversy where people are saying, the term is not used very much in Latin America, if at all. That a small percentage of people use it in the U.S. But of course, the push for it, like you said, was inclusiveness. Spanish is a very gendered language. Part of the resistance, at least from my perspective, seemed to be that it's hard to pronounce, especially in Spanish. Like it's fine in print. It's fine when you see it. Like I was thinking about your other book. Like how would you pronounce this?
Yeah, very, very difficult. Yeah. Latina Rising.
Well, I was saying Latinat. That's why I wasn't sure. But
it and I think the work that we've been doing with Latinx speculative fiction has happened in this time period where we've gone from really just Latino to Latina to Latina /O, using the @ the X or the E. Now is something.
The E is one I've heard. I like. That's actually pronounceable in Spanish. I first heard about that through Terry Bloss, the comic artist.
Yeah, and that's definitely more amenable to speech, So with Latinx, it's in many ways it's a symbol. It's not something that needs to be integrated into the language constantly, but it's a symbol of inclusivity. It's also from my point of view, like works really well with science fiction, speculative fiction, a kind of Latinx Files, which is the name of the book, that I wrote. So it works well with that kind of sensibility as well. It's almost kind of like a machine kind of sound. I don't know. I think that the way I look at it is society in general is experimenting right now with our structures of gender and sexuality and how that is interwoven with language, not just in Spanish. And so I think these are important. I think these are important ways to experiment, and at least make you think for a minute, like, am I being inclusive in my language, or who's being left out when I say certain words,
Well, speaking about
yeah.
inclusivity, that's kind of been the thrust of a lot of your work. You have more than one book that is kind of an anthology of collecting and celebrating Latino, Latina, Latinx writers. How many books have you been part of that involves that, and I guess including the ones you have coming up?
So there's Latinx Rising. That's the anthology of speculative fiction, Latinx speculative fiction. Then we have a young adult version that's coming out next year. Mm-hmm. And then I have a study of Latinx science fiction in particular. And that's an academic book. The first two are fiction anthologies, or fiction and art, actually. And then the Latinx Files is an academic study. I also have a translation of a short story collection by Pablo Brescia, who's a Argentinian, U.S. Argentinian writer now, and that should come out later in this year. ESC, Escape.
Tell me about how those translations are important. We talk about raising awareness. That always comes with the caveat of, we're talking about raising awareness in a specific community. So like, while somebody may be known in Argentina, they may not be as well known in the U.S., for example. And of course, the U.S. isn't the be all and end all for the world, but a lot of pop culture emanates from it. How important is it to get those kind of creators acknowledged in a U.S. context?
Yeah, I think it's really important in terms of like Latinx speculative fiction, because, and the reason is that the tradition in Latin America and the Caribbean is really strong in terms of science fiction and fantasy, and a lot of it has not been translated, and a lot of people are not aware of this really, really deep tradition. That's as deep as the tradition in the United States, and so there's been a couple of series. There's one translating Cuban science fiction into English. There's been a number of Argentinian works that have been translated, and part of the Latinx community in the United States is the people who recently come from Latin America and are writing speculative fiction. So for me, they're an important part of the U.S. Latinx community, which is very diverse. There's a lot of people with 5 generations in Nuevo Mexico, or in the Northeast. Or in Florida, like many generations. But there's also new writers coming from Latin America, and for me, they are part of the scene as well. And there's an interesting kind of dynamic and conversation that goes on. It's not like migration from Latin America happened once. Right. It's sort of a continual process, and so I think that great tradition in Latin America is coming to the U.S. as well, and has been. And so some of that's coming through translation, some of it through migration, and I think it just will strengthen the diversity of speculative fiction in the U.S., which is already kind of globalizing to a certain degree.
I think taking generations into account makes a lot of sense. I would consider myself about 3rd generation. I have a friend who's 1st generation, and he told me, for example, that he felt that as a child, there was a disconnect between what he heard from his parents But as an adult, he's really wanted to go in and explore that entire passage that his parents went through that he never really thought about until later on. And then as a teacher, I've worked with a lot of first generation students who are coming straight across, and they are very eager to get their voices heard in print and other media. Is the audience listening? Do you feel like there is a growing audience for that? Are people, and when I say audience, I don't just mean, non-Latinx people. I mean in general,
Yeah. So, definitely. We did a Kickstarter. I believe it's 2014 for Latinx Rising, and at that point, I was sort of like, I had done my dissertation on this topic of Latinx science fiction, something I was interested in personally, academically, and then we did a Kickstarter, and that in many ways that sort of showed to me that there really was an audience, a broad audience, many young, but not entirely, Latinx, non-Latinx people who really were interested and were coming from different perspectives, and some people had been waiting all their life for it, people who Latinos who grew up with Star Wars, and that was a deep part of their psyche. Many directly expressed to me, like I've been waiting for this all my life. Like this is the kind of stuff I want. And so that was a good kind of like mirror, to hear back from the community. Yes, we want these things, and the public nature of a Kickstarter online campaign was actually helpful for that, because I didn't know. I was just kind of like, hey, I want to do this thing, let me get these authors and artists together, but I didn't know what the response would be, but it actually turned out to be really great. And that has only grown. And
well, that's what I was going to say. You've mentioned this time a few times. Do you think that the reading audience is more perceptive, more eager to receive this now? Receptive is what I was looking for, not perceptive. Receptive for this now than they would have been maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, without a doubt. Yeah. Which is, I mean, the reasons for that, I think, are probably complex, but it just comes down to the changing nature of society and where Latinos and Latinas are recognized in U.S. culture, and a lot of fighting, especially from the Chicano movement, in terms of the media. And
when you say Chicano movement, are you talking about like 70s era, or are we talking about present day?
Yeah, 70s era, like trying to fight against the portrayal of Chicanos in the media. And so a lot of what we're doing now is sort of based on a lot of that fighting that has gone on for a long time.
And that ties to today as well. I saw this.
Oh, shirt, yeah, it doesn't end. Yeah.
On the shirt, you have this Star Wars-esque land speeder, but apparently going by a slatted barbed wire topped wall. Some subtle symbolism there.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of my interest has been in immigration policy, and how that sort of gets tied in with science fiction, and there's actually a lot of connections historically between migration and science fiction. If you sort of like shift the perspective a little bit, who are, like, in terms of like look at Star Wars, who are the rebels, who is the Empire, who is sort of like, the Han Solo character, like getting around the Empire blockades. They're the Mexican migrants who are coming to the U.S. and who have purpose, who have just purpose, and may not always be doing everything correctly, properly,
by the rules set by the Empire.
Yeah, And so I think those kinds of images and those kinds of shifts are also seen in a lot of indigenous art. So I live in New Mexico, and I've been living there this past year. A lot of indigenous art is using Star Wars imagery to kind of represent the empire and where Native Americans have been in that storyline. So yeah, that's where that's coming from.
It can science fiction fantasy be used for symbolism? Can you use them as satire? Do things have to be one-to-one to get a point across? Do you have to be like, well, it's a migrant story, so here is the story of a migrant on a migrant journey, going from Central America to the US? Or can you do like going from Mars to Neptune and still pull those same themes out of it?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it's always important to be as open as possible in terms of like the like aesthetic possibilities of science fiction and fantasy. So a lot of science fiction is very allegorical. Like, it's sort of like in your face. It's supposed to be that way, and so, sometimes that can be heavy-handed, but sometimes it can be very effective. I just the one that I think about is from Latinx Rising, Room for Rent, by Richie Narvaez. That story calls you to read it allegorically, but with the names of the characters who are connected to like Nuyorican slang.
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so the names of the characters are connected to Nuyorican, or Puerto Ricans living in New York, slang. And it
took me a second to catch up with that.
Yeah. So it's sort of like Pilgrim's Progress, this allegorical work, where the names are like faith and charity and all of that. But that work it calls you to read it allegorically, but not it's not in a heavy-handed way, and it's not simple as well. It actually ends up being complex. Who the aliens are in the story? There's multiple aliens. Who are the humans? There's complex ways of reading it allegorically, and so I think that that's certainly one possibility. An allegorical reading of a story going to Mars as a migration. There's actually a number of Mexican science fiction works about that. People, Mexican migrants going to Mars, and it's sort of paralleling the coming to the U.S. I think those are powerful, and they in some ways they sort of get right to the point. On the other hand, there's really no need for a work to be read allegorically, and there are many works that if you try to read them allegorically, you just sort of are going to miss the point. So it makes more sense to read them literally. A lot of hard science fiction, it doesn't really help to read it allegorically. You just read it literally and see what it's doing with society. And a lot of hard science fiction is about projecting technology or social structures into the future. There's no real point in reading that allegorically. It's just about, it's a mirror on society and where we think it will go and what that means, to Latinx communities in many cases, with the works I'm dealing with. So that's my perspective. I think that science fiction fantasy offers all kinds of opportunities, political, satire, allegorical, non-allegorical, and they're all part of the story for me. They all should come in.
Do you think that are there situations though where maybe somebody doesn't? Is there a risk that the audience might not recognize allegories when they are present, or maybe add some allegories that were definitely not intended by the author? Is that ever a concern as an editor or writer yourself?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's a deep question. I think that first of all, any story can be read in any way. So in many ways, you can't control, nor should we, what readers do. Like readers create the meaning of a story.
It's fair.
And actually, a lot of artists and writers will sort of make that an important part of their work, that I write the story, I get it out there, and people will read it however they want. And I think that's a good positive way of thinking about your own work, and it empowers in many ways the reader to make sense of the work for themselves. I mean, the writers that are in Latinx Rising, for example, they don't have one audience. Just thinking about like the diversity of the Latinx community and communities in the United States, there's not one audience for the work that we're doing. And so it really is important to realize that readers will take these works and make their own meaning out of them. Now, sometimes there's a really strong synchronicity, a really strong sympathy between, what I'm trying to do with this anthology, and a reader who sort of picks it up and says, "Oh yeah, I see that too," and I see what you're doing, and I really like that aspect. Those as an editor, those are really fulfilling moments. Like I said, a lot of the people directly just said, I've been waiting for this. So there was a real like synchronicity in terms of what I wanted and what other people wanted. And that was really cool. But that's not everyone. Some people just don't connect to it, or they don't connect to my particular interest in migration, or whatever. Yeah.
Well, let me ask, as an editor, what are you looking for in a writer? Like, are you asking people, Latinx creators who just want to do fantasy and sci-fi of any kind, or do you want the content of the story to also have either themes or characters that kind of follow along with part of things that would affect the community?
Yeah, so it depends on the situation. With Latinx Rising, it was the main concern I had, because it was like the first anthology of speculative fiction written by Latinx authors, to really show the diversity as much as I could. And so I tried to get, it's men and women in equal amounts, more or less, science fiction, fantasy, different kinds of stories, dystopian, utopian, aliens, to really just show the whole kind of range of kinds of stories that could come out there. And the purpose is not to kind of like form the canon of Latinx speculative fiction, but to show that these authors and this genre was part of speculative fiction all along, but it wasn't sort of being recognized. And likewise, I mean, I'm coming from, in grad school I studied Latinx literature, so it's also trying to expand that whole genre as well, where in particular science fiction was very much like not recognized.
I think that's true for literature in general.
Magical realism. So with Latinx Rising in particular, I was really trying to just explode that out a bit and say it's a part of Latinx literature, by the way, and also it's part of science fiction and fantasy, by the way, and you guys need to expand your borders.
You're talking about, when you say you guys, you're talking about like the, for lack of a better term, literature elite, people who would consider this to be considered classics, or this to be considered recommended reading for young adults, kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's right. So that, and in the first one, I was not looking for young adult stories, and I sort of felt that was important, a practical matter, because I was not trained in understanding and criticizing and young adult literature. but one of the things that came out of that experience is that I realized that there were so many young adult writers who are doing really cool stuff, and we're not doing maybe what cliche work and stuff that was completely derivative, but really original, cool stuff. So I had to train myself a bit. That's sort of the story of my life. But I had to
when you say train yourself, because you were not used to young adult literature as a concept, as a reader yourself. I mean,
yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, as a reader, yes, to a certain degree. I mean, but I mean, like from an academic standpoint, and understanding the genre as a whole. But so out of that experience, I sort of went in that direction and tried to learn as much as I could about that developing genre. And also, I sort of felt like I wanted to push it along as well. And so I think in our second volume, which is called Speculative Fiction for Dreamers, a Latinx anthology, that there's quite a lot of original work, a lot of stuff that is completely new, Latinx characters in science fiction and fantasy situations, you've never seen them. Young adults in science fiction and fantasy scenarios that you've never seen them. And I think that's a really important kind of development, and it will move forward, again, both speculative fiction and Latinx literature. And that's, for me, very exciting.
Well, I want to step back to talk about something you mentioned a few minutes ago. You mentioned magical realism. A lot of times when there is efforts in, I'm going to use the term pop culture, and by that I mean, traditional American pop culture, which is often, very Anglo, very, heteronormative. Is there a risk that when they bring in minority characters and concepts, it becomes almost kind of like a magical minority situation where it's like they're only known for this and that's what they're useful for in the background? Or is that something that can be leaned into? Is that something to be avoided?
I guess this is again my kind of story is my feeling is that magical realism is a great genre. There's a lot of potential for political satire and sort of destabilizing expectations. That's a powerful tool for an artist. But it's sort of been so correlated with Latin American literature, and then U.S. Latinx literature, that it's sort of been kind of defanged. That's my feeling. And so the idea of the work we're doing is to sort of say, hey, actually, yes, magical realism in Latin America has its own particular history. But it's also part of this other history, which is speculative fiction in general. I mean, you can look to Kafka. Kafka's an influence on magical realism. Kafka is an influence on speculative fiction in the U.S. as well. There's these crossing kinds of lines of influence, and so my idea is that you bring it in. You say, hey, this is also part of the story. Magical realism, historical fantasy, swords and sorcery. All of it is part of this collection of fantastical works. So it's not something to throw out at all. I think that's, that's kind of the opposite approach of what we're taking, which is, for a long time, Latinx authors have been specifically pushed out of science fiction for a variety of reasons. And so it's been there for a long time, but it's also had some struggles getting going. And so that's the idea, is bring it in, like don't don't push it out. Bring in Latinx science fiction.
Can I ask about some of those struggles that have happened in the past? What kind of situations have you seen as a scholar going through some of the history that you're like, well, this definitely needed to get more of a magnifying lens, I guess, than it got at the time?
Yeah, I mean, these would be a lot of them personal stories that I hear from people that they wanted to write a science fiction story or wanted to write a science fiction novel, and were kind of specifically dissuaded by a publisher. And so a lot of those are just personal stories. Some of them are out there that you can read. Ernest Hogan has some writings about the Chicano science fiction writer has some writings about his facing of the publishing industry. It also just sort of like goes along with the development of Latinx literature in general, where in a lot of the early, not talking about the 19th century, but like early 20th century, and then post World War II, a lot of those writings were meant for an Anglo audience who wanted a particular kind of story, like a story of immigrant assimilation, or a story, urban drug gang story with a redemptive ending, and those are fine in and of themselves. So the publishing industry, the readership wanted certain kinds of stories, and the Latinx literature sort of responded to that, definitely in the early days. That doesn't mean there weren't a lot of original and amazing works. There were, but the ones that really got mass kind of appeal were ones that sort of fit into a stereotype. So there have been many different pressures throughout the 20th century, from publishing and then academics as well, who are sort of many are kind of creating something like a canon, the list of accepted works that students should read.
I like applying that term
And
to this. As a teacher myself, I teach high school, and it's interesting when you see all of the accepted canon and then the bit of, well, we're trying to add a little bit more diversity here, and it's bits at a time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But yes, it's bits at a time. But at the moment, there really it is like in the last 5 years. I mean, I think it also correlates with the rise of Afrofuturism from like a kind of like undercurrent to like a major wave. And I think Latinx science fiction and fantasy is kind of going along with that, as well as just general social change. So it's the art has mirrored society and vice versa, and I think we're at a pretty interesting point right now where writers are feeling a lot freer to write what they want, and so we'll see what comes out of it.
Well, how important is it to get that community support, to have people like yourself and others collecting and promoting writers from the community? What kind of a difference does it make to have collections like this out for the public to be able to consume?
Well, so there's a number of different ways into that one. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of too early to tell. Latinx Rising came out originally in 2017. So in some ways, it's kind of too early. But I'm coming from the academic side, so one of my goals was to have these stories and authors kind of available to other academics who are interested in what I'm interested in. And so they don't have to start from zero, no, I didn't start at zero, but not too far from it. So that they can start with some information about who are the Latinx writers who are doing this stuff, and then they can take it wherever they want to take it. So for me, as an academic, it's important to provide that service to a certain degree. For other scholars who want to study these works. And when scholars study the works, they get more sort of circulation, more students read them, and so that there's that kind of there's that aspect. Outside of that, it's just a matter of my own personal experience that I can say. Since that time, when we did the Kickstarter, 2014, there has really grown a community of people who are interested in this topic, and it's way beyond academics. It's all kinds of readers and teachers, and I get lots of communications from high school teachers who see this and as important for their students. And I
hear from a lot of librarians that are always looking to expand their collections.
Yeah, that's right. And I was teaching the last 4 years in Puerto Rico, and my students there, most of them wanted to be scientists at the particular campus I was at in Calle. And it's like chemists and doctors, nurses, technicians, and Latinx science fiction has a lot of doctor, scientist characters that you do not find in Latinx literature in general.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that, because you hear a lot about people who say, "Oh, I got into science because I was inspired by this TV show or that movie or this book." And if you see characters in those TV shows, books, and movies that look or sound like you, it helps that appeal, I guess, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot. Yeah, that's right. A lot of scientists have pointed to science fiction as what sort of got them interested in that field. And so for me, that's a unique form of representation that only Latinx science fiction has been offering. And that presumably that will change in the future as Latinx literature in general develops. So that's another part of the story is it's the possibilities of and speculative fiction in general for particular kinds of representation, rather than just representing all Latinos, Latinas. It's
right.
It's not just that. It's particular kinds of characters with particular kinds of problems that they're having to deal with. So for me, there's a lot of subtleties as well in how these anthologies are affecting the readers.
Now, you've talked a little bit about how academics and about how readers might react. What about among creators, whether they're writers or artists or other types of creative individuals? Is there a lot of self-support within the Latinx community? Do you see creators kind of promoting each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely been, that's been part of the recent history, is that Latinx authors who are doing speculative fiction, academics, readers, are all sort of connecting in various ways, online and at conferences, now virtual conferences. And so that's really great to see. Yeah, because you feel then like, I'm not the only person doing this. That can give you a sense of kind of freedom and sort of liberation from the fear of, some people are fine, I'm the only one who does this, but many people aren't. It's helpful to have a community to support. Yeah, I mean.
Well, I noticed in your 2017 book that you had a piece by Javier Hernandez, who's a friend of mine. He made El Muerto, the Aztec Zombie, basically a superhero that has a lot of fantasy involved, a lot of sci-fi. There's giant robots and stuff, but your collection didn't have specific comics, though. So it's more of just kind of using his art to promote that idea. Do you ever see yourself being involved in a collection of maybe graphic fiction or like graphic novels, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I mean, there, in terms of promoting, there was an anthology that just finished a Kickstarter, Mañana, that looks fantastic. So I'm looking forward to that one. And they had an extremely successful Kickstarter, which was great to see, and went way beyond their goals. So that's something really unique, and again, wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. So that's cool. So I'm coming from the study of comparative literature, and rather than an English department. And but I think this sort of push is happening in the humanities in general. But my interests don't just remain with fiction, literature. And for me, science fiction is film and comics and even just imagery. Science fiction imagery. That's covers of books, and as in this case, a single kind of solitary muerto image, which takes that character and makes it into a more kind of like cosmic science fiction character, and that tells a story in itself. So I'm very comfortable in anthologies bringing in poetry. Well, in the young adult version that will come out next year, there's poetry, drama, a couple of drama pieces, 3 graphic short stories, literature, and so I'm very comfortable in being ranging across that the media, because they're all using speculative fiction, and in many ways to accurately represent that genre, you need to bring in these other media. And but that in many ways, well, in Latinx Rising, there's a photonovela. There's a photonovela called Coconuts in Space, which is a kind of fictional version of Puerto Ricans getting to the moon before NASA. And that's a really important work historically, for Nuyorican arts movement. But also it sort of like changes your vision of the moon landing, and what the moon landing meant, and how it was tied to nationalism, and what it would mean if Puerto Ricans had gotten to the moon first. And so it raises all kinds of interesting questions. So I'm very comfortable in bringing in all these media. I think it's wonderful. At the same time, like this anthology Mañana, that's also really important, because there is so much energy around the comic arts now, that having a full, like, super big anthology dedicated to that, I think is really great.
As we're talking about media, going cross media, I know that your background is primarily literature. I want to ask you something outside your wheelhouse for a second. Yeah. What do you think of the representation of Latinx sci-fi and fantasy in television and movies? Is it increasing? Is it present? Is there enough? Does it need to be more? Is it done right?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a good one. So there's been a very few like complete like Latinx science fiction and films and TV shows. The one that is really kind of well known in academic circles is Sleep Dealer. It's by Alex Rivera, that brought a lot of excitement and attention to Latinx science fiction. So that's one to kind of point to as a really big, fantastic highlight in that field. TV is a little more difficult in many ways, because you've got other forces at play, TV studios and all of that, and audiences that you're sort of playing to. And so there certainly have been really fantastic Latinx characters in Star Trek and the superhero show Flash. Lots of shows have had recently really great characters.
That's true. I know that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. made a big effort of making sure they had Latina and Latino characters as prominently as they could throughout the series.
Yeah, and those vary. Those vary, like how effective they are, and yeah.
Well, at the same time, there's movies like there was a recent movie called La Llorana a year or so ago that took this story that is very well known throughout different parts of Latin America. But they made the main protagonist an Anglo woman, and a lot of the Hispanic characters were basically background to her story. And I've been told that that there's a newer movie on the same kind of concept that's made by a Guatemalan director that I haven't checked out yet, but I've heard is very good. Is that ever a concern? I know that other groups have talked about the idea of, for lack of a better term, whitewashing. Where you take concepts and just kind of put it over and have somebody else be the main character, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely happens more like in the fantasy realm, where the U.S. is drawing on mythology or legend from Latin America. The chupacabra, for example, there's a thousand different. Yeah, there's 1,000 different horror movies based on that some have nothing at all to do with Puerto Rico or Latin America or anything. So I think that's been more in terms of like fantasy, supernatural, legend, mythology. And I think that's not just Latin America. That goes for like many parts of the world where the U.S. is sort of cannibalizing mythology as a source of horror, that this is the non-rational, and I think there is great danger there, and in my view, it's been one of the sort of general social points of resistance to Latinx science fiction in particular, which is not based in the mythological or the magical or the irrational, that sort of like pushes against this general sort of stereotype of Latin America in general as the place of superstition or mythology. So I think it's a real danger, that sort of continuing to whitewash Latin American legend mythology. I think it's awful, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. Maybe a little bit. I mean,
like it's one of those things where every time people are like, "Okay, we're good. We're not doing that anymore," and then a new movie or show will come out, and you're like, "Oh, kind of."
You did it again, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. No, I mean, I guess the good news is that not just many of the authors from Latinx Rising, David Bowles, who you mentioned before as someone you had talked to, a number of the authors doing speculative fiction are being contacted by TV producers, filmmakers who like not independent filmmakers,
Right. People, I know that David, for example, has worked with some pretty big names in Hollywood as an advisor, helping them out.
Yeah, and Lalo Alcaraz,
of course,
was a big consultant in Coco.
I think that made a big difference too.
Yeah. I mean, if you have no Mexicano on the staff, okay, fine, hire one.
You mentioned Afrofuturism earlier. Do you think that Latinx science, sci-fi, and fantasy will have that Black Panther moment where we get, because the conventional wisdom in Hollywood, and I say conventional wisdom, I mean by like the bigwig producers, was often, a black-led science fiction superhero could not happen. And then, of course, it was like the biggest moneymaker from Marvel up to that point, and Marvel was already a juggernaut. Do you think Latinx creators will have that moment anytime soon?
Yeah, you expressed that question very clearly, which is great. I think it's a question that everyone sort of has in the back of their mind. I don't know. I don't know if it's I don't know. It's certainly possible that there is some sort of major shift. Coming out of the Trump presidency, where Latinos and Latinas were kind of the original bad guy. That's
bad hombres.
Yeah, I mean that was that was his whole platform essentially. I think it's possible as a sort of kind of like reaction to that, that society would see the kind of like absurdity of that position and sort of like make a kind of like leap forward. I think that's possible, but that's just a prediction. And like I said, that's sort of made possible also by the fact that there are many opportunities that are sort of arising in terms of TV. Now, I guess I should mention also like Robert Rodriguez.
Of course, yeah.
There's a whole other strain, like Texas kind of independent filmmaking. That whole like push itself. I think that's part of the story as well, because he certainly connected to a lot of Latinx themes, and he Latinx characters and artists and actors. So that's been sort of going along as well, and it sort of crosses into the mainstream at times and goes back independent work. So that's another one to kind of keep an eye on in terms of like a big moment, in terms of Latinx.
You think that kind of push could come more from an indie, whether it's an indie publisher or an indie creator or an indie filmmaker, probably before it's going to come from like a major studio or a major publishing house or something like that. Not to say that major publishing houses aren't making Latinx books available, but I'm saying, do you think that kind of thing that gets people to notice it? When I say people, I mean like a broader audience. Do you think that'll come probably from an indie creator before it'll come from a big studio?
That's a good. Honestly, that's a like a question. That's a little bit outside of my realm, because I really don't know a lot about like Hollywood and that stuff. I mean, I have talked to a producer in Hollywood who's interested in what we're doing, and all I do is refer him to the authors. Because I really offer nothing in that realm, other than wanting it to happen, So there's actually been a couple of possibilities coming out of that. There's a story in Latinx Rising called Caridad by Alex Hernandez, and that's been sort of like pushed through the system, Hollywood system a bit. Who knows?
You mentioned to me earlier when we were talking about this that solidarity is an important part of making this community work. What do you mean by that? What do you think is really needed to promote and foster this kind of creativity?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm sort of just thinking about, and I think is worthwhile sort of like discussing with the community, is that there's something particular about speculative fiction that it enables us to think about various configurations of society and Latinx communities. And very often in Latinx science fiction and fantasy, we have a kind of different way that Latinx communities relate to each other. And I think this is important because it points to the diversity, the enormous diversity of these different communities. And, if there's a conflict between Mexicans and Salvadoreños, in speculative fiction, you can sort of rethink that and say, what would happen if these two groups needed to come together for some reason and change sort of how they saw each other? And it's not really something too common in Latinx literature in general. Kind of getting back to the idea that we're sort of pushing against science fiction and fantasy as a genre, but also to Latinx literature. And speculative fiction gives us a space to imagine different groups collaborating, feeling sympathy for, hablando en español, connecting culturally, like Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Florida. How these two groups connect to each other and have a feeling of solidarity with each other. And so it's something I'm beginning to think about, that speculative fiction has a particular role in forming the political potential of Latinx communities in the U.S., where a lot of it's based on feeling some kind of solidarity so that you can affect some kind of change. When Trump is talking about Mexicans derogatively, that does not just affect Mexicans.
Right.
All Latinx communities feel that to a certain degree, and speculative fiction can kind of say, okay, let's imagine Chicano groups, Cuban groups, Puerto Rican, Dominican, sort of coming together and to sort of like react against that. And I've seen some, just one quick example of Sabrina Vorvolias's novel Ink, which really kind of it's a very near dystopian kind of immigration novel, where different communities are sort of relating differently and coming together to form political action. So I think it's unique. It's one of those things that excites me about the field, is it can do something unique that other genres can't do.
One thing I find really interesting about all that is that you mentioned, the different, we keep using this blanket term, Latinx, or whatever term people may be more comfortable with, but it is a blanket term, and it doesn't cover, one group. You're talking about many different national identities. Even within those national identities, you have different ethnic and cultural identities. There's indigenous communities. There's communities that speak completely different forms of Spanish, or as you said, communities within the U.S. Is that solidarity something that can maybe be seen as an umbrella over these individual groups? And is there a need for people outside the Latinx community to acknowledge that these are disparate groups and not just one solid block?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Big questions.
No, it's a great one. Yeah, I think it's a big concern right now. In a lot of discussions in Latinx communities, what ways that racism is being played out in maybe subtle and different ways than in U.S. Anglo communities, and that can be in terms of Afro-Latinxes. It can be in terms of indigenous groups, and certainly in terms of the work that we've been doing, making an effort to reach out to people who may not identify as Latinx but as indigenous. Has it's been in our mind and something we've tried to do, but I still think that there's a lot more to be done there, and I still think that a lot of the same divisions are being reproduced, and more work needs to be done on that. Absolutely.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. How can people find you on the web?
So you can look at two websites, MatthewDavidGoodwin.com and LatinoSpeculativeFiction.com. And I'm on Twitter and Facebook, the Latinx Files. If you look up the Latinx Files, you'll find it. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for being here. And thank you guys for watching and listening. Thank you for being here with us today as we talked with Matthew David Goodwin, talking about Latinx speculative fiction and also solidarity in the greater Latinx community. This has been part of Geekspanic Heritage Month, which again runs from September 15th to October 15th. For this and other content focused on Hispanic heritage and Latinx culture, please visit www.nerdtinoexpo.com and be sure to follow Nerdtino on all the regular social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, @Nerdtino. Thank you so much and good night.